11 days after my sister and her husband died in a car accident on a rain-slicked stretch of Interstate 71, a woman from Franklin County Children's Services sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me, gently, apologetically, that according to the documents on file, I was not listed as an appropriate guardian for my niece and nephew. I had raised those two children every single summer of their lives. I had a room in my house with both their names painted on the door. I had been present at both of their births, and according to a guardianship designation form filed 4 years earlier, signed by my sister, notarized, entirely legal on its face, I wasn't fit to raise them at all. Custody, the document said, in the event of my sister's death was to go to my sister's mother-in-law, a woman my sister had, as far as I knew, barely spoken to in over 2 years. I sat at that table and said, my sister would never have written that. I was right. She never did. Took me 4 months, a forensic handwriting examiner, a private investigator, and one very long night going through 6 years of my sister's old emails to prove it, and to find out exactly who had and exactly why. If you're new to this channel, welcome to Family Hidden Fight, where we tell you the truth about the wars fought behind closed doors, inside families when nobody else is watching. Today's story is called The Paper That Said I Wasn't Fit. Let's begin. My name is Michelle Castellano. I'm 41 years old, a pediatric occupational therapist in Columbus, Ohio. And for most of my adult life, my younger sister Jennifer was the single most important relationship I had. We grew up 3 years apart in a small house in Dayton, raised mostly by our grandmother after our mother's addiction made her unreliable in the ways that mattered most during our childhood. Jennifer and I were close the way siblings get close when they've had to parent each other a little, when they've learned, young, that they're each other's most dependable person in a house where dependability wasn't guaranteed. Jennifer married a wonderful, quiet man named David Kessler when she was 26. David worked in logistics for a regional trucking company. Jennifer taught 3rd grade at an elementary school in Westerville. They had 2 children, Sophie, who was 8 at the time of the accident, and Ben, who was 5. I never married. I never had children of my own, not by any tragic circumstance, just the ordinary drift of a life that took a different shape than I once expected. And so my relationship with Sophie and Ben became, over the years, one of the central joys of my life. I took them every summer for 2 weeks while Jennifer and David took a trip together, something they'd done since Sophie was a baby. I was there for both births, standing in the hallway outside the delivery room both times, the first person besides David to hold each of them. I had a spare bedroom in my house, painted a soft yellow, with both their names stenciled above the door in Jennifer's own careful handwriting, because she'd done it herself one weekend when Sophie was 3, laughing the whole time about how crooked the letters were coming out. Jennifer and David died on a Tuesday night in October, on their way home from a rare date night, when a semi-truck hydroplaned across the median on I-71 during a sudden downpour. They were both killed instantly. Sophie and Ben were at David's mother's house that night, where they'd been staying for a planned overnight visit. David's mother's name is Patricia Kessler. I found out about the accident at 11:40 p.m. from a Franklin County Sheriff's deputy standing on my front porch, and the next several days exist in my memory only in fragments. The identification at the coroner's office, the funeral arrangements Jennifer and David had, thankfully, put in writing years earlier through their church, the strange, floating unreality of grief that makes you capable of signing paperwork and answering phone calls while some deeper part of you hasn't processed anything at all. I assumed, without ever explicitly discussing it with anyone, that Sophie and Ben would come to me. I had no formal legal guardianship paperwork of my own. I hadn't thought I needed it, because Jennifer and I had talked about it, years earlier, in the vague, hopeful way people talk about arrangements they never expect to actually need. She'd told me more than once, sitting on my back porch with a glass of wine, If anything ever happened to us, you're it, Michelle. You know that, right? I believed her. I had no reason not to. 11 days after the accident, 11 days during which Sophie and Ben stayed with Patricia Kessler, their paternal grandmother, in what everyone assumed was a temporary, practical arrangement while the family sorted out the details. A caseworker from Franklin County Children's Services named Renee Ashworth came to my house for what I understood, going in, to be a routine home visit as part of assessing me as the children's guardian. Instead, she sat across from me at my kitchen table, opened a folder, and told me, as gently as someone can deliver information like this, that a designation of guardian form was on file with the county, filed by Jennifer 4 years earlier, nomming Patricia Kessler, not me, as the intended guardian for Sophie and Ben in the event of both parents' deaths. I need to be honest with you, Renee said. Mrs. Kessler has already begun the formal guardianship petition process, citing this document. Given that the children are already in her physical care, and given that this designation exists on file, the county's default position is going to lean towards supporting the existing arrangement, unless there's a compelling reason to challenge it. I asked to see the document. Renee slid a photocopy across the table. It was a single page, a standard Ohio guardian designation form, filled out in what looked, at a glance, unmistakably like my sister's handwriting. The same looping J, the same small, precise letters I'd seen on birthday cards my entire life, dated 4 years earlier, notarized by a notary whose stamp I didn't recognize, nomming Patricia Kessler as the intended guardian, with a brief, typed explanation in the reasons for this designation, field statting that Patricia had more stability, more resources, and a more appropriate home environment for raising children than I did. I read that sentence 4 times before I could speak. My sister had never in her entire life said anything like that about me. Not once, not close. I want to walk you through what it actually feels like to read a sentence like that, in your dead sister's handwriting, 11 days after burying her, because I think people who haven't lived through something like this assume the primary feeling is anger, and it isn't, not at first. At first, it's a specific, disorienting kind of grief on top of grief. You're not just mourning your sister. You're mourning the version of your relationship you thought you had, wondering, in the middle of the worst 11 days of your life, whether the woman you loved more than almost anyone on earth had secretly, quietly, believed you weren't fit to raise her children. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with that photocopy in front of me until the sun came up, staring at my sister's handwriting, trying to reconcile it with 20 years of birthday cards, grocery lists, notes left on my counter when she'd stop by to drop the kids off, the crooked stenciled names above my guest room door. Somewhere around 4 a.m, staring at that page for probably the 100th time, I noticed something. It was small, the kind of thing you'd only catch if you'd spent a lifetime looking at someone's handwriting, the way only a sibling really has. My sister crossed her 7s. She'd done it since high school, a habit she picked up from a math teacher who insisted on it to distinguish 7s from 1s, and it had stuck with her for the rest of her life. Every 7 she ever wrote, on every form, every check, every note, crossed through the middle. The date on the guardian designation form read a year that included a 7. It wasn't crossed. I called a family law attorney the next morning, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Karen Illick who specialized in contested guardianship cases, and I told her, somewhat sheepishly, about the crossed 7, worried it would sound like the kind of thin, desperate thing a grieving sister grasps at because she can't accept an unwelcome truth. Karen didn't dismiss it. Handwriting inconsistencies like that are exactly the kind of detail forensic document examiners look for, she said. It's not proof on its own, but it's a legitimate reason to have the document formally examined before anyone treats it as settled fact. I'd also want to know who the notary is. And I'd want a copy of every other document your sister filed or signed around the same date, so we have genuine comparison samples. We hired a forensic document examiner named Robert Aldis, a soft-spoken retired state crime lab analyst who'd spent 30 years testifying in exactly this kind of dispute. I gathered every sample of my sister's genuine handwriting I could find, old birthday cards, a mortgage document from around the same period, a permission slip for a school field trip I'd found, still taped to my refrigerator from that same general time frame that Jennifer had filled out and signed while dropping the kids at my house one afternoon. Karen also hired a private investigator, a former Columbus police detective named Frank Ackhaffer, to look into the notary listed on the guardian designation form, a woman named Cynthia Rourke, whose notary stamp appeared on the document but whose name meant nothing to me, someone I had never once heard my sister mention in 20 years of closeness. What Frank found within the first week changed the entire shape of this story. Cynthia Rourke was not, and had never been, an independent notary with her own practice. She worked, at the time the document was purportedly notarized, as an administrative assistant at a private wealth management firm in downtown Columbus called Beringer Trust Advisors. The same firm, it turned out, that had managed a modest trust fund established years earlier by David Kessler's late father, David S.R. A trust that named Sophie and Ben as beneficiaries, to be released to their legal guardian for their care and education until each child turned 25. And the account manager at Beringer Trust Advisors who oversaw that trust, according to the firm's own public staff directory, Patricia Kessler's younger brother, a man named Gerald Voss. I hadn't known, until that week, that a trust fund even existed. Jennifer had mentioned, in passing over the years, that David's father had left the kids a little something before he died. But I'd always assumed it was a modest savings account, a few $1,000s, the kind of small, sentimental gesture grandparents sometimes make. Karen requested the trust's records through the formal guardianship proceeding, since as an interested party contesting the guardian designation, I was entitled to relevant financial information affecting the children's welfare. The trust was not modest. David S.R., who had owned a successful chain of auto parts stores across central Ohio before his death 9 years earlier, had left Sophie and Ben a joint trust valued, at the time of my investigation, at just over $2.1 million, funded by the sale of the auto parts business, invested conservatively over nearly a decade, and structured so that the appointed legal guardian of the children would have significant discretionary control over trust distributions for their care. Education and general welfare until they came of age, significant discretionary control. I sat with Karen in her office, looking at the trust documents, and finally understood the actual shape of what I was looking at. This had never really been about who loved Sophie and Ben more, or who had a more appropriate home environment, the phrase used in that fraudulent designation form. It was about who would control legal discretionary access to over $2 million in trust assets for the next 20 years. Assets that Patricia Kessler, as the children's guardian, would have wide latitude to direct, with the trust's own account manager, her own brother, overseeing the investments and, presumably, the fees generated by managing an account of that size for 2 decades. I want to be careful here, Karen told me. We don't yet have proof that Patricia orchestrated the forgery herself, as opposed to, say, her brother acting somewhat independently to protect his own management relationship with the trust. But given the financial stakes involved, and given that her own brother's employer notarized the exact document nomming her as guardian, this is well beyond the realm of coincidence that any court is going to accept without serious scrutiny. Robert Aldis's forensic analysis took 6 weeks. His written report, once complete, was unambiguous in a way that surprised even Karen, who told me she'd expected a more hedged, cautiously worded conclusion, given how forensic document examiners typically qualify their findings. The report identified the missing crossed 7 as one indicator among several. More significantly, Aldis's analysis of letter formations, stroke pressure, and pen lift patterns throughout the document found consistent, structural divergences from the genuine comparison samples, divergences he characterized, in his professional opinion, as highly indicative of forgery by an individual attempting to closely replicate the subject's natural handwriting style, rather than genuine variation within a single writer's normal range. In plain language, someone had studied my sister's handwriting closely enough to produce a convincing forgery, but not perfectly enough to catch every habit, including a small, decades-old crossed 7 that only a sister, or someone who'd spent an enormous amount of time with her handwriting, would ever think to look for. Robert also flagged something in the typed reasons for this designation section of the form, the sentence claiming I lacked stability and appropriate resources. Genuine guardian designation forms, he noted, referencing a standard template used across Ohio courts, typically include this section as an optional narrative field, filled in by hand or left blank by the person completing the form. This particular document's narrative section had been produced by a typewriter or a very specific dot matrix style printer, a detail that, combined with everything else, suggested the entire document had likely been assembled and filled out by someone other than my sister entirely, on a template downloaded or obtained separately, rather than filled out in the ordinary, informal way most people complete this kind of form at home. While Robert conducted his analysis, I spent almost every night for 6 weeks going through 6 years of my sister's old emails, an archive David had given me access to shortly after the funeral, thinking, correctly, that I might want to preserve some record of Jennifer's voice, her ordinary daily correspondence, the small mundane proof of a life fully lived. I wasn't initially looking for anything related to the guardianship dispute. I was grieving, mostly, reading old emails about parent-teacher conferences and grocery lists, and a long, funny exchange with a friend about a disastrous Thanksgiving dinner 3 years earlier. But somewhere in my 3rd week of reading, I found an email exchange from roughly the same period as the date on the fraudulent designation form, an exchange between Jennifer and David, forwarded at one point to a close friend, discussing, in blunt and unmistakable terms, exactly the opposite of what the forged document claimed. I told Patricia again tonight that if anything ever happens to us, Michelle takes the kids, full stop, no discussion, Jennifer had written, in an email to David that she'd apparently forwarded to her friend Angela a few days later with the subject line, "For the record, in case I ever need to prove this to anyone." I know she doesn't love hearing that, and I know she thinks she and Gerald could manage things better given the trust, but that's exactly why it has to be Michelle. Money makes people weird about kids, and I'm not having Sophie and Ben's whole childhood run by a trust account instead of by people who actually just love them. I sat in my dark kitchen at 1 a.m. and read that email probably 15 times, for the record, in case I ever need to prove this to anyone. My sister, 3 years before her death, had apparently already sensed exactly the kind of pressure Patricia and Gerald were capable of exerting, had already put her real, explicit wishes in writing, forwarded to a friend specifically, so there would be a record, almost as though some part of her had anticipated this exact fight happening someday without her there to settle it herself. I called Angela the next morning. She remembered the email clearly, confirmed she still had it in her own archive, and agreed, without hesitation, to provide a sworn statement. I confronted Patricia at her house, 3 days after Angela's statement was formalized, sitting in her living room while Sophie and Ben were at school, a conversation Karen had advised against having without an attorney present, but one I felt, in the moment, that I needed to have anyway, for reasons that had less to do with legal strategy and more to do with needing to look this woman in the eye. Patricia is 68 years old, a retired school teacher. The kind of woman who bakes for every neighborhood potluck and remembers everyone's birthday. I want to be honest that some part of me, walking into that living room, still hoped there was an explanation that didn't involve deliberate fraud, some misunderstanding, some version of events where Patricia herself was as much a victim of Gerald's scheming as the children were. That hope didn't survive the conversation. "I raised David," Patricia said, her voice tight, controlled, when I laid out what Robert Aldis and Angela's statement had confirmed. "I know what those children need better than a woman who never even had children of her own." Jennifer wrote, in her own words, 3 years before she died, that she wanted me to have them, I said. "In writing, Patricia, forwarded to a friend for exactly this reason." "You had a document forged, using your own brother's employer's notary stamp, nomming you as guardian of a $2 million trust that your brother happens to manage. That trust is for the children," Patricia said, and for the first time, her composure cracked just slightly into something closer to real anger. "David S.R. built that business with his own 2 hands. I'm not going to stand by while it gets handed over to someone with no relation to my son at all, no understanding of what that money represents, so it can just get spent down by a woman who's never had to manage anything more complicated than a school field trip. It's not your money to protect from me," I said. "It was never yours at all. It's Sophie and Ben's, and Jennifer trusted me to make sure it stayed that way." Patricia didn't confirm the forgery outright that day. But she also, notably, never once looked me in the eye again for the rest of the conversation, and when I stood up to leave, she said, quietly, almost to herself, "Gerald said it would never be found." I heard it. Karen's investigator, sitting in his car outside with a legally permissible recording device running per Ohio's one-party consent laws, heard it too. Karen filed a formal petition contesting the guardian designation, presenting Robert Aldis's forensic report, Angela's sworn statement corroborating Jennifer's genuine and explicit wishes, Frank Ackhaffer's investigation connecting the notary to Gerald Voss's employer, and the recorded admission from Patricia's own living room, which, while not an explicit confession, was damaging enough on its own that even Patricia's attorney reportedly urged her, in the days that followed, to consider whether continuing to fight the petition was in anyone's actual interest. The guardianship case moved to a formal evidentiary hearing in Franklin County Probate Court roughly 5 months after Jennifer and David's deaths, 5 months during which Sophie and Ben remained, per the court's temporary order, in Patricia's physical custody, a period, I want to be honest, was excruciating for me, watching from the outside, allowed only supervised weekend visits, while the actual legal question of where they belonged remained unresolved. I want to pause here and say something directly to anyone watching this who is currently living through a contested guardianship situation of their own. The system moves slowly, deliberately, sometimes maddeningly so, and it is designed that way on purpose to make sure no decision about a child's placement happens hastily. That deliberateness is, in the abstract, a good thing. It is also one of the hardest things I have ever endured, watching 2 children I loved as my own life, temporarily, under the roof of the person I was actively proving had committed fraud to keep them there. The evidentiary hearing lasted 3 days. Robert Aldis testified for most of the first morning, walking the court through his findings with the same careful, methodical precision that had characterized his written report. The crossed sevens, the letter formation divergences, the anomalous typed narrative section inconsistent with how the standard form was ordinarily completed. Angela testified about the email, reading the relevant portion into the record, for the record, in case I ever need to prove this to anyone. In a moment, I will remember for the rest of my life, watching the presiding magistrate's expression shift, almost imperceptibly as those words landed in the courtroom. Frank Ackhaffer testified about Gerald Voss's employment at Beringer Trust Advisors and his direct management of the Children's Trust, laying out, methodically, the financial incentive underlying the entire dispute. The fees, the ongoing management relationship, the discretionary control over $2.1 million that a guardianship designation in Patricia's favor would have effectively guaranteed for the next 2 decades. Gerald Voss himself was called to testify, under subpoena, and invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination when asked directly whether he had arranged for the guardian designation form to be notarized by a colleague at his firm despite the signer's absence. A moment that, while not itself an admission of guilt, spoke volumes to everyone in that courtroom, including, visibly, the magistrate. Patricia testified last, and her testimony was, in its own way, the most difficult part of the entire hearing for me to sit through. Not because it was damning in the way Gerald's silence had been, but because I could see, watching her on the stand, a genuinely grieving grandmother who had convinced herself, over months of encouragement from her brother, that what she was doing was protecting her son's legacy rather than committing fraud against her own grandchildren's actual, documented wishes from their mother. She never fully admitted to knowingly forging the document herself. She maintained, throughout her testimony, that she believed the document was legitimate, that Gerald had presented it to her, in the weeks after the accident, as something Jennifer had genuinely signed years earlier and simply never told anyone about. The magistrate did not find that explanation credible, given the timeline, given Gerald's Fifth Amendment invocation, and given the financial motive clearly established through the trust records. But the magistrate's written ruling, issued 9 days after the hearing concluded, was notably more measured toward Patricia than toward Gerald, finding that while the document was almost certainly fraudulent and could not be relied upon to establish Jennifer's actual wishes, the evidence did not conclusively establish that Patricia herself had personally forged it, as opposed to being presented with a fraudulent document by her brother and choosing, whether through willful blindness or genuine belief, not to question it. The magistrate voided the guardian designation form entirely, finding it unreliable and very likely fraudulent, and based on the totality of evidence presented, including Angela's testimony about Jennifer's genuine, explicit, contemporaneously documented wishes, my established and lifelong relationship with Sophie and Ben, and the court-ordered guardian ad litem's independent recommendation, filed weeks earlier after her own investigation and interviews with both children, awarded permanent legal guardianship of Sophie and Ben to me. The ruling also addressed the trust, recognizing the clear financial motive underlying the dispute, and citing specific concern about Gerald Voss's continued management of the account given his role in the fraudulent documentation. The magistrate ordered the trust transferred to an independent, unaffiliated trustee, with Beringer Trust Advisors formally removed from any role in managing Sophie and Ben's assets going forward, and with a court-appointed guardian ad litem retaining ongoing oversight authority to review distributions until both children reached adulthood. I remember standing outside that courtroom on a cold January afternoon, watching Karen shake hands with the guardian ad litem, and feeling a wave of relief so overwhelming I had to sit down on a bench in the hallway for several minutes before I could stand back up. Not triumph, exactly. There was no triumph in any part of this story, not with my sister and her husband gone, not with 2 children who had lost their parents, and then spent 5 months caught in the middle of an adult fight over money they were too young to fully understand. Just relief. The specific, exhausted relief of finally, after 5 months, being legally recognized as exactly what I already was to those two children. Their family, their home, the person their mother had actually chosen for them. Sophie and Ben moved into my house, their room, with their names still stenciled crooked above the door, on a Saturday in late January, almost exactly 5 months after the accident. Ben, 5 years old, mostly wanted to know if his old bed would still be there, and cried with relief when I showed him it was, exactly where it had always been. In the same spot it occupied every summer of his life. Sophie, 8 and old enough to understand far more of what had happened than I ever wanted her to have to carry, asked me, on her first night in the house, sitting on the edge of her bed, whether Grandma Patricia had done something wrong. I have thought a great deal in the time since about how to answer a question like that honestly to an 8-year-old who has already lost both her parents and doesn't need, on top of that grief, to lose the entirety of her relationship with her father's side of the family too. Some grown-ups made some really bad choices, I told her. But your mom loved you and your brother so much that she made sure, a long time ago, that no matter what happened, you'd end up somewhere safe with someone who loves you. That's me, and that's not going to change, no matter what anyone else does. Sophie thought about that for a long moment. Can we still see Grandma Patricia sometimes? She asked. I told her yes, eventually, once things settled. We probably would, a promise I have, in fact, kept in a limited, carefully supervised way. Because whatever Patricia did, and whatever role she played in a fraud, I still believe she at minimum chose not to question closely enough. She is still the only living grandmother Sophie and Ben have, and I have tried in the years since to hold that complicated truth alongside everything else. The same way I've had to hold complicated truths throughout this entire ordeal. Gerald Voss's role in this story did not end with his Fifth Amendment invocation in that Franklin County courtroom. The Guardian ad litem's findings, combined with Frank Ockhaffer's investigation, were referred to the Ohio Secretary of State's Notary Oversight Division, and separately to the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. Given the clear evidence of a fraudulently notarized legal document used in an attempted guardianship fraud connected to a multi-million-dollar trust. Cynthia Rourke, the notary who had stamped the document, lost her commission entirely once the investigation confirmed she had notarized a signature without the signer present, a violation she ultimately admitted to, in a statement to investigators, claiming Gerald had told her the document was just a formality that Jennifer had already agreed to verbally, and simply hadn't had time to come in and sign in person, an explanation that satisfied no one. Least of all the disciplinary board that revoked her license. Gerald himself was indicted, roughly 14 months after the accident, on charges including forgery and attempted theft by deception, tied specifically to his role in orchestrating the fraudulent designation with the clear financial motive of preserving his firms, and his own management fees on the trust for the next 2 decades. His case is, as of the recording of this video, still moving through the court system, and I've been advised by Karen not to speculate publicly about its likely outcome while it remains active. What I can tell you is that the evidence assembled through the guardianship proceeding, Robert Aldis's forensic report, Angela's email, Frank Ockhaffer's financial investigation, has been made available to prosecutors, and that a case built on that foundation is, in Karen's professional assessment, an unusually strong one. I want to spend some time here on something I think is genuinely useful for anyone watching this video, beyond the satisfaction of hearing how the story ended, because I made a mistake, an understandable one, an extremely common one, but a real mistake nonetheless, that I don't want anyone else watching this to repeat. I trusted an informal promise instead of insisting on formal documentation. Jennifer told me, more than once, sitting on my back porch with a glass of wine, that I was, it if anything ever happened to her and David. I believed her completely, and I was right to believe her sincerity, but sincerity is not the same as legal protection, and the absence of my own formal guardianship paperwork is exactly what created the opening for Patricia and Gerald to exploit in the first place. If Jennifer and David had filed a proper, unambiguous guardian designation nomming me, the way, it turns out, they'd actually always intended, based on everything we eventually proved, there would have been no vacuum for a forged document to fill. The county caseworker would have had a clear, legitimate, properly executed record to point to from the very first day. And Patricia and Gerald's fraud, whatever they might have still attempted, would have had to overcome an existing legitimate document instead of simply filling an empty space where no formal paperwork existed at all. If you are the person in your family that a sibling, a friend, anyone, has ever said informally, "You're it if anything ever happens, please," I am asking you directly, watching this video, turn that informal promise into an actual, formal, properly executed, and filed legal document. It costs, in most states, very little money and very little time. It requires an uncomfortable conversation about mortality that most people would rather avoid. And it is, without exaggeration, the single piece of paperwork that stood between me and permanently losing my niece and nephew to a fraud I very nearly never discovered at all. There's one more piece of this story, and like the last story I told on this channel, it's a voicemail, because I've come to believe, going through this experience, that the people we love often leave behind small, unintentional pieces of proof of their real intentions, tucked away in ordinary moments we don't think to save until we desperately need them. About 8 months after the ruling, going through an old phone I'd kept in a drawer after upgrading years earlier, I found a voicemail from Jennifer, dated almost exactly the same week as the forwarded email to Angela. A voicemail I'd apparently saved and then completely forgotten, buried in an old device I hadn't turned on in years. "Hey, it's me," her voice began, casual, a little rushed, the sound of someone calling from her car between errands. "So, weird conversation with Patricia today. I'll tell you about it later, but I just wanted to say, you know you're the one, right? For the kids, I mean if anything ever happened. I know we've never made it official, and I keep meaning to get that sorted with an actual lawyer, but I need you to know whatever anyone ever says, that's what David and I both want, no question. Okay. Love you. Talk soon. Keep meaning to get that sorted with an actual lawyer." My sister knew, in that unguarded, ordinary voicemail left from her car, exactly what needed to happen, exactly what she intended to do. She simply ran out of time. The specific, devastating cruelty of a sudden, unexpected death, the kind that doesn't wait politely for people to finish the responsible things they always meant to get around to. I have played that voicemail more times than I can count in the 2 years since I found it. I play it on hard days, when Sophie has a nightmare about the accident, or when Ben asks, out of nowhere at the grocery store, why his mom isn't the one taking him shopping. I play it, and I hear my sister's voice, casual and certain and completely unaware of how urgently those words would someday need to be proven true, and I remember that whatever Patricia and Gerald tried to take from these children, they never actually had a claim to it at all. Jennifer had already decided. She'd just never gotten the chance to finish making it official. I finished it for her. Sophie is 10 now. Ben is 7. They are, by every measure that actually matters, thriving. Sophie plays travel soccer and has developed, to my great amusement, her mother's exact sense of humor, dry and a little sharp and always landing at unexpected moments. Ben has started asking harder questions about the accident as he's gotten older, the kind of questions that don't have easy answers, and I've tried to meet each one honestly, at whatever level of detail feels right for a 7-year-old, without ever pretending the loss is smaller than it actually is. I formally adopted both children 14 months after the guardianship ruling, converting what had started as a guardianship into a permanent legal adoption. A process Karen recommended once enough time had passed to establish stability, and one that Sophie, old enough to understand what it meant, asked for herself, one evening at dinner, in a moment that undid me completely. "Can your last name be our last name too? Like for real on paper?" "It is now. Sophie and Ben Castellano." On paper, and everywhere else that has ever actually mattered. The trust remains intact, professionally managed by an independent trustee with no connection to Patricia or Gerald, growing steadily, waiting for two children who have no idea, most days, that it even exists. To grow into an adulthood their grandfather wanted to help fund, back when he built an auto parts business with his own two hands, and never could have imagined the fight his generosity would eventually cause. If you're watching this and you are the person in your family, the aunt, the godparent, the close family friend, the person a parent has said, informally, over wine on a back porch, "You're it if anything ever happens," I want you to do one thing before you finish watching this video. Call an attorney. Ask about a formal guardian designation. It usually costs less than a nice dinner out, and it usually takes less than an hour of an uncomfortable conversation nobody wants to have. Do it anyway. And if you are a parent watching this, thinking about your own children, thinking about who you've told, informally, that you trust to raise them if the unthinkable happens, please put it in writing. File it properly. Don't let your real intentions live only in a voicemail your sister finds 2 years too late, in an old phone in a drawer, after months of fighting a fraud that never should have had any opening to exist in the first place. My sister loved her children more than anything in this world. That love was never in question, not for one single day of this entire ordeal. What was almost lost, what very nearly slipped away entirely, buried under a forged signature and a $2 million motive, was simply the paperwork that would have made her love legally undeniable from the very first day, instead of something I had to spend 5 months and every resource I had proving in a courtroom. Don't leave that proof to chance. Don't leave it to a voicemail. Write it down, file it properly, and make sure the people you trust never have to fight the way I did to become, on paper, what they already were in every way that actually mattered. My name is Michelle Castellano, and this has been another family hidden fight if this story moved you. If you've ever had to fight to protect a child you loved against a family member who saw them as something to be managed rather than someone to be raised, tell us in the comments. Your story could become a future episode on this channel. Subscribe for a new family hidden fight story every week, and we'll see you in the next one.